So I'm Cameron Stuart, just call me Cam. I work for Swan Insurance as a Rails developer. I've been there for about a year and pretty happy to sort of move away from Rails and get into Meteor. I think that's really the technology of the future. I like fitness and I dislike overcooked software. So again, that's why I like Meteor, because it's not overcooked. So not all projects are greenfield. We see a lot of tutorials and a lot of talks about, sort of, I guess, basic concepts and, just getting started with Meteor, and that's obviously very important to, kind of bring people into the community. But what we don't often see is talks that are kind of going into the kind of real-world challenges that you really face when you sort of say, okay, I'm going to do this. And sort of, I'm sure you guys have found, you've been all through all of these sort of problems. So what actually spurred this talk on for me is a client of mine, well, a company I used to work for about 20 years ago, without giving my age away, is an engineering firm, and they've currently got an Oracle system that they pay about $15,000 a year just in licensing alone. It's very old, it's pretty ordinary really, and it's costing them a lot of money. And they said to me, could I, build something new for them? And I thought, well, this would be a good opportunity to really cut my teeth with the Meteor app. But the number one challenge, and before I even bothered to give them a quote, was I took a copy of their dump file from their Oracle database, and I thought, well, okay, can I actually get the data out of there and into Meteor, and how painful is that going to be? Because that's really a big aspect of when you're trying to price a job, is to think about, well, can I actually do it, let alone, how long is it going to take? So we currently don't really have a command line tool like in Rails. If anyone's familiar with Rails, we have a tool called Rake, which is great for running sort of command line tasks that involve the application stack. So any code that you've written within your application is available to you within that command line. So there's a lot of other sort of similar implementations along those lines, but we don't really have anything at this stage in Meteor because it's fairly new. There is one package called MCLI, which I found, which is actually pretty good. But as you can see, it's still fairly young, only 26 installs there. It's probably got a little way to go, and I actually found that although it really is looking like it's got what we need, the solution I ended up coming up with I thought was probably a little bit more useful for what I wanted to do. So what we'll do is we'll basically go through a little GitHub repo that I created. So here it is here. And we'll basically just check out code in steps sort of as we work through the challenges. And this is pretty much sort of the development approach that I took to end up getting myself into a situation where I was able to get this data out of Oracle and into my Meteor application. But of course, we love working with the To-Dos app. So what I've got is to-do data in MySQL that I wanted to migrate across into the existing to-do app that you get when you create an example project in Meteor using create-example. So let's get started here. So simple seeding. Most of you are probably familiar enough already with the startup on the server side, the startup where you can put a little bit of basic seed data. Everyone here sort of done any of that sort of stuff, or anyone doesn't know what I'm talking about? Yeah, most of you know. And in the To-Do sample app, we've got an example of that. So let's have a look at that now. So basically in this bootstrap file here, we've got, as you can see, all of the data that we want to load up. So when startup occurs, if there's nothing in the lists collection, smash all this lot in, which is great way to get started, great way to handle default users and things like that. But if you're looking at bringing data in across from a legacy system or some other database, then you probably need to think about going to the next step. So the next step is calling a webhook, which is my sort of decision as to how to handle this. So let's check the code out at that stage. So you can see now that bootstrap file's gotten smaller. I've really just moved that seed data elsewhere, but I've done it as a Meteor call to a server method called import to-do data. So we've got our methods here now, and there's our import to do data. So that's just really moving it, but at least now it's in sort of a central spot that we can work with, and we've got an area to actually do the import. I think at this stage I've created a server-side route. Let's have a look. Yep, I have. So this code down here gives us now a webhook to be able to trigger it. So we've actually got the best of both worlds here. When the app starts up, it's going to have a look and say, oh, have I actually got any data in the database? No, I haven't, so I'll call that server method. Or we can also call that server method by running either a curl command or hitting that address in the browser, because it's just a get request. So here we can just do a curl, and that'll just hit it, and that'll reload our data that way. So that's not bad, but again, I mean, we've still got our data, hard coded in our actual application code base. So where's this loading code going to live? So we've got now, just a basic method, and in there we've got our code. But probably if you're doing some sort of a complex structuring situation, complex data import, the structuring of the code is probably going to be a little bit more advanced. So let's go to the next stage. I love copy and paste. There's no way I'm going to type all of that, although I do know you can actually just check out using just a portion of that MD5. So now we've created a couple of extra files, and we've got this lib directory now. Now, excuse me for using CoffeeScript, but when it comes to doing a little bit of database object-oriented inheritance and things like that, I found CoffeeScript to be quite nice, especially on the server side. So we've got a base class there. We've got a constructor for it. We're just calling the parent one there. We've introduced now a settings file. So we've actually got some information for some database credentials. So what we're going to do is we're actually going to, within our JavaScript code on the server, connect to our remote database and run our code through our application stack and load it into our own collections. So the next stage is to actually get a connection going. Now in this case we've got a connection here to MySQL, and this was quite an adventure for me. When you're working with MySQL or any other node package for that matter, you run into the challenges of asynchronous execution. And as everyone knows, that's probably one of the most difficult topics to wrap your head around. So I found that as I was actually getting into this, wanting to basically connect directly and do a query straight in, MySQL query here, run through the result set and attempt to put it into my local collection, that I was running into these errors. So this error here is basically in relation to you're not using any kind of wrap async or fiber Meteor bind environment. Now, it's interesting that I ran into this particular problem while trying to connect directly to MySQL, because while I was trying to connect directly to Oracle, I ran into different challenges, which again made it a real roadblock in terms of importing my data. And that was actually getting the node driver to work correctly under OS X. It appeared to install cleanly and it appeared to work correctly, but when I actually made my connection to the Oracle database, the whole Meteor server would just crash and restart with some pretty strange looking symbol errors and all sorts of stuff. I thought, do I want to go down that rabbit hole and troubleshoot those issues? And I decided that I didn't want to do that. So the next stage I thought, well, there must be a better way. What have we got? So calling that webhook, as you can see there, just using curl. There's our little bit of a UML to show our database structure, our object-oriented structure of the code that we've got. Installing the MySQL driver was actually pretty easy and it felt painless, and I was feeling quite confident that everything was just going to work quite nicely. But when I tried to sort out this wrap async business, I just went nuts. Like, that was pretty difficult. So I think that that's definitely the thing I need to learn and work on the most is how the asynchronous and synchronous behaviour is supposed to be handled. But I felt like I wanted to defer that learning at this stage until we get promises, and I just made a promise to myself that I'll come back and make a direct connection to MySQL. You see what I did there? So this is an alternative approach, which, you know, on the surface might sort of seem a bit odd, but what I basically did was, and it ended up very easy. So this source database, in my case, was Oracle. In this example here, it's MySQL. I just knocked up a little Perl script. Now, you could do this in Python, Ruby, whatever you like. And you just simply query your source database and say, hey, what tables have you got? And then loop over those tables into a select star from those tables, and then just grab each hash that you get and just smash it in there. So you've basically got an exact copy of your relational database in a Mongo database. Now, connecting your Meteor application to an external Mongo database whilst it's connected to its own Mongo database is actually very easy. So that was the solution that sort of allowed me to carry on and get done what I was trying to get done, because I was, you know, looking at the price that I've quoted these guys and saying I probably spent about 30 hours trying to get this data out of this Oracle database, so I'm losing money here. So as you can see here, fairly short code, and I will show you the packages file, because thanks to David sitting up in the corner there, his Mongo collection instances package was invaluable for doing this work, because the connection to the two different services, the external Mongo database and the one that's internal, obviously you get your connection to your internal database for free, you just speak to the collection. But dealing with a remote is not really much work. As you can see here, you've just got a DSN string, and what's interesting here is that if you were to take this application into production, you know, you might want to actually connect to a MongoDB, you know, who knows where to source your incoming data. And with Meteor, you can actually launch Meteor with the appropriate environment variables, allowing you to connect to a different Mongo instance. So you could have your actual source data local or remote, and you could start up your app local, pointing at a local Mongo database, and run your import process. So really though, we haven't seen so far the real benefit of why we would want to, you know, really do this through Meteor and not just actually have our own external scripts that directly connect to databases and do what they need to do. So as I said earlier, having access to the application stack for me was, you know, quite valuable. I really wanted to be able to speak to these collections, you know, in a language that they understand. So using simple schema was something that I really wanted to be able to do. Not just to be able to validate the data that's coming across and make sure that the schema structure that I've defined for my internal database is capable of holding this data that I'm migrating from and into my database. I wanted to make sure as well that you know, I could take advantage of some of the other activities that Simple Schema can do, or Collection 2 can do, which is, for example, setting default values and things like that, you know, doing these validations, but also the clean operation. So when you actually bring data across, you can see here, I can basically say, well, here's my little block, which is essentially validating the data that's come in. So here's a to-do record that's come across. We're checking it's valid against the to-do schema and making sure it's okay. And if it's not, well, at this stage, we're just logging a message. But if you were doing a large data import, at this point, you might smash that data across into a separate collection with the necessary validation errors, and then you could come back and deal with that later. Or you might, you know, completely drop out. You might be expecting your data validation to go all the way through, you know, whichever the case is. So this actually meant that I could run this clean operation before I actually did the insert, which is, where's clean? List ID. Must be in the next checkout. Let's have a look. No, it should be in here. Oh yeah, there it is there, that line there. So that clean invokes any auto value or default value. I'm not sure if anyone here has worked much with simple schema. I think most people that work with Meteor pretty quickly discover that that's like a gold package that you really do want. So any auto value or new value or callbacks and anything like that that you've got going, when you call that clean on your piece of data, then that'll make sure that it's trimmed white space off of the front and back of strings and populated auto values with what you need, all of those sorts of operations. So, now the script, I'll just show you the Perl script to actually do this. It's pretty minimal really. So we've got this data directory now, we've got a little shell script in here to drop and rebuild the database, nothing special. Here's the Perl script here, fairly straightforward. I mean, this is the JavaScript thing we're talking about here, and Perl's a lot uglier than JavaScript, I'll grant you, but really you've just got a connection to your databases here, a query to find out what tables are available in the source database, looping over the result set that you're getting back, and then just basically going through each one, selecting your data from that table, and just clearing out the collection and then loading the new records as we go. So that's 58 lines, 59 lines of code, and you've essentially got whatever database, because in a language like Perl or Python or Ruby or whatever you want to use, you can connect to almost any database. You might have some legacy data coming in from LDAP or who knows what random data sources. If you write this type of generic import mechanism into a Mongo database and then from within your application draw that in and structure it the way you need it and validate it against your own schema, then you've got access to the application stack and any code that you've written within your application. So that's the collection helpers and the other package of David's really helpful for that. So I was pleased to come across that. A couple of things that are probably on the horizon and I will encounter, because I'm dealing with the data for this application that I'm working for sort of on a piecemeal basis. So as I move across data, and I'm about to hit some data that's got some dates within it. So when you query from, in this case, an Oracle database, the format that the date comes back in is not really that valuable. So what's probably necessary is to not just use a meta query to actually determine from the database what tables are available, but then on each table determine what the columns are within the table and construct the SQL string to select the data dynamically with the appropriate formatting on the date column so that you can bring it out in a format that's going to go into Mongo database as a clean JavaScript date sort of structure that's actually going to be useful. Also, I did notice that when you bring across data from a relational database that's null, that will go in as a string into Mongo as null. So you've got to watch out for that one as well. So you've actually just got to empty that data out. In bulk data loading, it's a fairly common relational database technique when you're loading large quantities of data is to either disable or drop the indexes on the table. So at the moment, you can put your indexes with simple schema actually in the schema, which is really cool. But what I haven't done, so say for example here we've got the text field, we could just simply go index true, and now you'll get an index on that column. So obviously pretty important if you're searching on that one, but the downside of course when you're loading large amounts of data is when you have those indexes is that every time a record inserts, the index is rebuilt, so that slows the import process down. There's trade-offs there because of course if it is a collection that's being read in real time, then that means that any queries would now be slow because there's no indexes on the tables, or on the collections I should say. So that's a trade-off, but something that's worth knowing how to do. So far I haven't discovered a way to do that, but speaking to David earlier, he suggested that there are some ways that you can get some lower level access to the Mongo driver. So that's something I'd like to actually have a go at. And as far as going into production is concerned, you may want to still have this webhook available so that it can perform certain updates and so on, but obviously when you run your curl command you may want to have a header with an API key so that not anybody can actually trigger its behaviour. And so using that webhook I guess is a great way to kind of avoid I guess the old school method of having a web application with some sort of a cron job that's written in a different technology that doesn't have access to your application stack, classes and database handles and so on. That's it. Any questions?
So how much data did you do with that?
This Oracle database that I'm migrating from's got over 350 tables. On average, you're looking at anywhere from 500 to a couple of thousand records. So altogether, it's 20 to 50,000 records. I didn't really count, to be honest, but it smashes along quite nicely. Yeah.
But you're still bringing actually data in the relational form. Wouldn't you denormalize data while you were importing?
Absolutely, yeah. Well, I mean, that's the beauty of it. Once you've brought it into an intermediate Mongo database, from there within your webhook, that's where you're essentially saying, well, I'm now restructuring this and making it the format I want for my application's purposes and making sure that that's valid according to the schema that I've defined. That's where that's happening at that point. That's where the munging is essentially happening.
Would it be easier to write, sort of, well, I guess it's more than SQL is easier to write against relational data, creating basically views in Oracle and bringing them in as already denormalized.
Use the views to get the data.
Yeah. You could do that. I mean, absolutely. I mean, this is basically a first cut at this particular challenge. I mean. One of the things that's, Meteor is very exciting technology to work with, but it's not like you can go onto Stack Overflow or find a lot of blog posts on how to do a lot of these specific techniques. And so you find yourself sort of saying, well, okay, there's a perfect way to do it and there's some other options and there's trade-offs along the way. I really felt like I wanted a situation that I could, my big goal was to be able to validate against my application schema. Because I knew I was dealing with data that was very old, very untrustworthy. And as I was bringing it in, what I thought was the appropriate structure was going to work on a record-by-record basis. So that was fairly important to me. But, like I said, some other failed attempts I actually had was to load the data into an intermediate Mongo database, dump the collection to a JSON or CSV file, and then import it into Meteor. The problem I found there was Meteor generates its own ID identifiers, whereas Mongo will have the object ID bracket, the ID in it. And so then when I was looking at my routes, I actually had object ID, in the route. I wasn't particularly happy with that. Plus also a MongoDB object ID is actually giving the end user some information about that record that you may or may not want to expose, like the created at timestamp. That's how those object IDs are actually constructed. So there was that challenge, and it was sort of easier to I find it easier when I'm migrating data from one source to another to have a connection to both databases so that I can say, I need to query back on this guy and find out that and go over here and get this data and munge it all together into the structure I want and then go into my database.
Did you have any data type issues, for example, numbers, strings, weighted, flows?
Not so much like that. My structure's mostly numbers and things like that. Text, a few numbers, probably dates though, as I said before. That's the next stage for me, is to dynamically construct a select query from the source database to actually say, give me this date field in this structure, and actually have some sort of sense and logic around that, so that as those data types come back into the intermediate Mongo database, that their data types in JavaScript are essentially the same when I'm saving them locally. But I think, I'm fairly confident that, simple schema and collection 2 will cast those guys across. If the schema says this needs to be a number and it comes across as 1 with quotes around it, I think you'll probably be pretty safe. Yep.
You have the import with the PostScript is a one-time import of the data.
Absolutely, yeah. When you go live, you might run it one more time, as to sort of start fresh or get a recent copy of the data. But yeah, that's only a one sort of step operation.
Do you have any idea or suggestion on how to live migrate existing data from one database to?
How I've done that in the past is with an intermediate database that tells me what records and what IDs have gone across. And if you're fortunate enough in your source database to have updated at timestamps, which you probably aren't, because Murphy's Law, it's probably an old database and they didn't do those things in those days. Then what I usually do is I essentially collapse the record together into one dirty big string, get a hash of it, and store that in a collection somewhere else. And then as I'm bringing data across, I say, has this guy changed? It has. Let's do an update. Is this a new record? Let's add it. So you've just got to kind of query backwards and forwards to say, does this exist here? Does it exist there? Has it been changed? So you can run that as an ongoing process. Yep.
Just wondering, have you done anything to convert over the existing document IDs from perhaps those just numbers?
You mean from the intermediate Mongo database?
Well, when you're importing, like, if you've got relations and joins by ID
Yep.
documents in a relational database, do you convert them over to Meteor IDs, for instance, or do you just leave them as they are?
Well, I basically leave the data as it is, and when I'm in my final, insert into my local collection, that's when I've already joined those things together. Like, say, for example, the to-do database example is actually relational in that it's got a list of to-dos and then you've got a to-do collection separate. But for me, I might typically make that, just a to-do collection and an array of to-do items within it. Well, I would just say, well, give me the list item and now query the guys by ID, build them together into an array and then store that in the database as is.
So the problem with the drivers, is that because they're node drivers, or where is the root of the problem?
I feel like it's OSX related.
Yeah.
In order to get the data, this is where I do all of my work. In order to get the Oracle database operational on here, I spun up a Vagrant virtual machine, which I was very fortunate to find a CentOS image that already had Oracle XE installed.
Yeah.
So with this much of a Vagrant file, Vagrant up, and it downloaded it, and up came this CentOS instance ready to go.
Yeah.
So I loaded my dump file into that, and so communicating within there, and then I installed Mongo into that as well. So that VM had those two databases and the Perl script moving data between them.
Yeah.
Then the Meteor app just simply connects to the virtual machine IP address and port number that's Mongo's listening on.
Yeah.
So that was fine, but as far as the node client running on my OSX is concerned, I installed the instant client, followed all the documentation, set up LD library path, all of the...
So it just wasn't reliable, or just didn't work at all?
It appeared to install cleanly, and no issues when the server started, but when you attempted to do a connection, when that code that actually had the connection statement invoked, Meteor just went kaplooey. It just died and then restarted. And I was trying to sort of trace back through it. I've got some skills with those types of things, and I looked at it and I thought, bit of Googling, no, I'm out here on the bleeding edge. Like, I'm on the desert island with just the one palm tree. Like, I'm totally on my own with this.
I tried a similar thing on Windows, trying to get data out of SQL Server from Node.
Yeah.
Similar.
Yeah.
And just couldn't make it work, and I reverted to the same ruts and Perl. Bang, it's done.
Yeah, okay.
So quick.
That's right, exactly. Well, this is just it. You may actually be bringing all of this into an intermediate Mongo database, not just from Oracle or SQL Server, if you're unfortunate enough for both of those, and a bit of DB2 and some LDAP.
Yeah.
Like, you don't know where you're getting it all from. So if you just bring all of that across into a Mongo database, and then from there, your application stack can make more sense of it.
Yeah. It just seems a shame that the database drivers for Meteor are clearly not great, or there's some...
I think we talked a little bit before about, packages. You try 2 or 3 different ones, and I found that there's actually a couple of different MySQL packages.
Yeah.
There was only one Oracle Node package. So, like I say, whether it was an issue with how the instant client, because you need the Oracle instant client installed on OSX and the appropriate environment variables exported, and I'd done all of those things, followed it all through. And it seemed to be a clean installation of the Node package. That looked fine to me.
The Oracle's always fussy anyway.
Well, that's right. And as soon as I got a whiff of that, I thought, no, I need an alternative here. Yeah. Any other questions? Cool. We're all done. Time to go home.
Thanks, Cam.
No worries.
I just want to say thanks to everyone for coming out, and thank you to our speakers tonight. Next meetup will be on 7th of October. We run them first week on a Wednesday of each month, so we'll be putting that up shortly. And if you are on Twitter,